Just before we turn to Rachel, there are 3 open seats up front. For those of you bold enough to come up, there are seats. Please join us.
Thank you, Chris. Chris is always too kind to me. I first went to Afghanistan in 2006, and by about 2008, when the conflict was at this high level and civilian harm was at such terrible levels, I was working for Human Rights Watch, and I met Chris when, as he says, he came for General McChrystal, and he really was responsible for that strategy rewrite in 2009. I remember there are many of you in the room who spent quite a lot of time in Afghanistan, as many familiar faces. I'm sure many of you remember reading that 2009 strategy. Jaws were dropping at how precise its analysis of what was going wrong was. It was really surprising, because until then there'd been this feeling that the thinking was very blinkered. So there is this growing realization of something very serious is going wrong. It's having huge strategic impacts, as Chris has described. And then a series of reforms are put in place. Now, these included things like a civilian casualty tracking cell. This was a crucial building block for starting to really realize the scale of civilian harm and start to believe it with their own numbers, not just listen to the UN's numbers that were coming from outside. A series of tactical directives were put in place, which did things like define when airstrikes could be used, require call-outs before night raids. And you saw a very dramatic drop in civilian casualties. So in 2008, pro-government forces, the US primarily, was responsible for 39% of fatalities, which is extraordinary when they're up against this terribly indiscriminate adversary with very low-precision weapons like the Taliban. By 2012, that had dropped to 9%. So it's a very dramatic fall, even through the troop surge, and an uptick in the tempo of operations. So it's a very impressive period in terms of the speed with which these reforms took hold in terms of the civilian casualties. It wasn't enough that there were tactical directives. Command emphasis was critical, and many of the people we spoke to stressed that it was the leadership from people like General McChrystal that really drove home the message that this was of strategic importance, a strategic necessity, not just a legal nicety. Also critical was improved analytical capabilities, both in terms of the continuous learning so that it was really understood what was causing the civilian harm, but also broadening the lens so that there was more understanding of this wider frame that we're using. We're talking about civilian harm and not just civilian casualties. So the example Chris gives is a very clear picture of those wider consequences of harm, whether it's entrenching, super-empowered, abusive local security actors or militias, the kinds of things that will drive communities away from their government. And again, in terms of my experience, I felt like there was a real opening of the doors to information from outside sources, the kind of credible civil society organizations that had a lot of information to share and had been trying to do so for some time. So dramatic results. It was too late, frankly, to repair the damage in terms of many of those communities that had already switched sides. It did start to help to improve the relationship with the Afghan government. There were some concerns from, I'd say, a minority within the military that this was causing them harm. This was putting US military at greater risk. And this is hugely important. As we did this research, we really wanted to examine this, particularly in a sort of campaign climate where you've had presidential candidates arguing for the gloves to be off or even war crimes to be committed. So we really drilled down at the empirical evidence that was out there and really didn't find anything to back this up. In fact, if you look at a time period from 2007 to 11, you do see a spike in the use of IEDs by the Taliban, which did result in more US military fatalities, but not in terms of the numbers of US forces, because that was during the troop surge. So actually, in terms of ground engagements, US fatalities and ground engagements, which is the best indicator of whether forces were being put more at risk, you actually see a decline during this period as a percentage compared to the numbers of troops there. So it's a period of extremely positive lessons in many ways. You know, the US demonstrated that it could put in place much improved civilian protection for a relatively low cost. So the question we wanted to answer with this report is to what extent has that been institutionalized and absorbed and applied in terms of working with partner forces, which is so key in so many of the US operations today, but also in terms of the US engagements itself in other contexts. So looking at ANSF briefly, unfortunately, I would argue basically that it was too little too late with the ANSF. We've seen, sadly, a big spike in civilian casualties caused by pro-government forces in Afghanistan. In 2014, it jumped by 51%, in 2015 by 28%. And this is partly to do with the changing nature of the conflict, of course, but it's also, I think, because the ANSF have very thin adherence to IHL. And I think they certainly haven't grasped that lesson, that it matters strategically to them to be really improving their civilian protection efforts. They do, on the positive side, have a civilian casualty tracking cell, which is a great start, an important foundation stone, as I say, for ISAF at least. But they're massively undercounting harm. So if you look at numbers in 2015, they think that pro-government forces were responsible for 200 civilian casualties. The UN puts that number at 1,200. So there's a massive gulf between those two numbers, and I'm afraid my money is on the UN in that case. There's a lot more work to be done there, and I think particularly on the analytical side, they're starting to be able to do the reporting, but they really don't have the analysis capability yet. In terms of other conflicts then and the US's partnerships, I mean, Yemen is unfortunately a rather poor example at the moment of US efforts in working with other partners. The Saudis, as we know, have been responsible for very serious violations of the laws of war in their operations in Yemen, and they're doing so with US assistance on refueling, arms trade, and intelligence sharing. And I know the US is starting to try and work with the Saudi military to try and improve its protection of civilians, but it's clearly got a very, very long way to go. In Iraq and Syria, now it's a very complicated environment, and here you've got actors like Assad's forces and ISIS committing egregious war crimes. So to talk about US civilian protection efforts in that context is difficult. Clearly they're in another league and really hard to compare. But I do think it's fair to say that the US really does not know the scale and impact of the civilian harm that it's currently causing in Iraq and Syria, and the civilian harm being caused by its partner forces, particularly partner forces who we know have somewhat different strategic priorities and track records in terms of civilian protection. There are already some very serious allegations being made about some of the Kurdish partner forces in terms of their adherence to laws of war. And again, similar, there is a tracking cell that's in place in Iraq and Syria. It's a good first step. Again, there's a massive undercount. They're admitting to, I think the current number is 41 civilian casualties, civilian fatalities at present after more than 9,000 airstrikes, which compared to their track record in Afghanistan would suggest an extraordinarily better track record in terms of civilian protection, so it doesn't quite seem credible at the moment. So there's still a long way to go. So I'll turn to my colleague Chris, who will talk you through some of our practical recommendations.